Hi, my name is Ellie Fisher-Shah. My television perspectives module, I was part of Reboot Culture, and this is my assignment for the first half of the semester. First off, we'll start with what is a reboot. Well, using information and quotes from my research, I can define reboot as the shorthand to describe a broad host of narrative operations and contradictory groupings from sequels, prequels, adaptations and revivals, reimaginings, relaunches, and generic refreshers, as said by William Proctor. He also says that reboots not only begin again, but they also seek to spur interest in a new diegetically independent sequence. While looking into this topic, I'll be using Ghostbusters as a case study, focusing on the 1984 original and the 2021 sequel, Ghostbusters Afterlife. I'm intentionally not using the 1989 Ghostbusters 2 or the 2016 female reboot, as Ghostbusters 2 largely repeats the original's mix of comedy and plot structure, and doesn't offer the same kind of story reset or franchise shift that Proctor sees as key to reboots. While the 2016 film functions as a full reimagining and diegetically separate relaunch that would require a whole different analytical frame. By comparing the 1984 original with Afterlife, I can discuss how the franchise's legacy is reused and reshaped over time, showing how these films reflect Proctor's idea that reboots both start fresh and renew audience interest in a new, self-contained story. For my report, I mainly focus on trying to understand the characteristics of Ghostbusters 1984 and how this led into the reboot Ghostbusters Afterlife in 2021. And how this was received by audiences. Firstly, I'm going to break this report down into 3 sections to make it easier and clearer to follow and understand the progression of my work. In section 1, I'm going to discuss the origin of the original 1984 Ghostbusters, its genre, and the defining characteristics. So essentially, what makes Ghostbusters Ghostbusters? For this section, I used 4 academic sources, which are shown here. Okay, so I think it's important to understand how Ghostbusters began. Lebrecht describes the early ideas of Ghostbusters as Aykroyd's brainchild, Aykroyd being the actor of Ray in the film. Aykroyd himself explains that his great-grandfather was an Edwardian spiritualist, and he took from his family history and married it with the ghost comedies in the 1930s. So essentially his fascination with the paranormal was one of the leading inspirations for the Ghostbusters, which was originally called Ghost Smashers, according to James Green. Lebrecht says that Reitman, the director, helped pare down the time-travelling multi-dimensional aspects of Aykroyd's darker original treatment and sold it to Columbia as a then pricey $30 million story about a team of supernatural exterminators in New York. Ghostbusters had never originated in any other media form before the 1984 film, so it wasn't a comic or a book first. The Ghostbusters you see on the screen is the world's first official taste of the franchise. That is, of course, if we set aside from the frequent spectacle of film shoots unfolding across Manhattan streets. For New Yorkers, the film shooting was daily entertainment unfolding on their sidewalks, in quote to Lebrecht. So the film had a fair amount of recognition before it was even released. If we're to talk about the genre of Ghostbusters, overall most sources say this is a comedy. For example, Stephen Hayward, who says this comedy, alongside Lebrecht, who describes it as a comedy ghost movie. Comedy appears as its core genre, and this is probably due to its humorous characters and witty dialogue. However, Lebrecht also says it holds a mix of horror and sci-fi elements, with Green calling it a futuristic ghost-chasing fantasy. So ultimately, while comedy anchors the film, its fusion of horror, science fiction, and what Green describes as a refreshingly weird fantasy is what gives Ghostbusters its enduring originality and cross-genre appeal. Which leads us brilliantly into our next point, the defining characteristics of Ghostbusters. So essentially this means, what makes Ghostbusters Ghostbusters? Firstly, some people feel as though Ghostbusters is simply a love letter to New York in reference to Lebrecht, with its dynamic energy, iconic landmarks, and portrayal of the city as both chaotic and charming, existing at the heart of the movie. Additionally, Paul Feig and others may say that the core of Ghostbusters is the theme of, and I quote, starting a business. The feeling of building something from the ground up, facing skepticism, financial risk, public scrutiny. It mirrors the entrepreneurial spirit that drives both the characters and the film's broader narrative. On top of this, Feig also explains that the expression of sexism and misogyny is central to the film, with, and I quote, male expressions of homophobia and sexual anxiety is embedded deep within his narrative, shaping the overall tone of the film. And finally, there are Bill Murray and the rest of the cast. Many might say that the actors that truly make Ghostbusters what it is. Their performances can be seen to shape its tone, humour and lasting appeal, and Feig says that Bill Murray's improvisations dominated every scene, ultimately giving the film its spontaneous offbeat energy and the comedic rhythm that the rest of the cast built upon. Moving into the second section of this report, here we're going to discuss how Ghostbusters 1984 was rebooted into Afterlife 2021, what references are made, going into what the new film gives back to old fans, and what relationship does the 2021 film have with the 1984 original. For this section, I used 3 academic sources, which are shown here. First up, I'll say what Clark Collis said. Ghostbusters Afterlife is not a remake, but it's definitely a sequel. It follows Egon Spengler's daughter and grandchildren as they inherit his Oklahoma farmhouse and uncover his secret efforts to prevent the return of Gozer, the ancient entity from the original film. James Greeby describes the film as a bit of a departure from the 80s movies, with other sources from Stephanie Zacharek agreeing saying that Afterlife is less about zapping ghoulies than it is about family, reconnection and forgiveness. If we connect this back to the key identified characteristics of Ghostbusters 1984, it appears as though the sequel diverges significantly from its predecessor. Afterlife largely abandons the urban identity of New York and places little emphasis on entrepreneurship and omits the cultural attitudes such as the underlying homophobia present in the 1980 context. However, It deliberately reintroduces the original characters to preserve nostalgia and continuity. But as Zacharek notes, the alienation of Spengler from his ghost-busting pals disrupts the spontaneous and offbeat group dynamic that was a key characteristic to the original film. Some people see Afterlife as geared to plink at heartstrings, with much hugging and many tears, in reference to Zacharek. We return to Proctor's definition of reboots as generic refreshers designed to spark interest in a new diegetically independent sequence. Afterlife appears to embody this idea by revisiting the 1984 film and refreshing its outdated, problematic themes. The reboot seems to target a younger, more modern audience by emphasising emotional resonance and softening the edgier humour that was a lot more common in the 1980s. This shift is further reflected in the change from a PG rating for the Ghostbusters from 1984 to a 12A rating for Afterlife, signalling the move towards more nuanced storytelling that honours the original while updating it for contemporary viewers. While its departure from the 1980s film may appear to reshape the Ghostbusters atmosphere, the sequel still subconsciously honours its origins and rewards long-time fans through deliberate references. As James Greeby notes, there are several plot points that directly reference or echo the story of the original, including the renewed focus on Gozer, the ancient god central to the 1984 narrative, and the inclusion of iconic artifacts such as the proton packs, the old uniforms, the old fire station, and Exo-1 which was discovered in the farmhouse garage, some of which are shown on screen now. Together these facilitate the gradual rediscovery of the Ghostbusters legacy so many years on. On top of this, Afterlife's visual effects team studied the footage of the original Stay Puft Marshmallow Man to make their CGs match, in the words of Clark Hollis. They also attempted to mirror the staticky, zigzaggy Ghostbuster gun effects to continue the creative language, making it visually reminiscent to the returning audience. Moreover, the appearance of the four main Ghostbusters and their receptionist from the original cast can be seen as one of the film's most directly emotionally resonant references to its predecessor, with the grandfather being none other than the Ghostbuster, Dr. Egon Spengler, as shown in the photo on screen right now of Egon Spengler from the original and Phoebe Spengler from the sequel. The actor of Egon unfortunately passed away in 2014, and bringing him back as a ghost serves as both a tribute to his legacy and a narrative bridge that connects the original film to Afterlife, reinforcing the emotional and nostalgic continuity for longtime fans. And finally, as the last point of this section, what is Afterlife's relationship with the original 1984 Ghostbusters? James Greeby says that Ghostbusters Afterlife is very much a direct continuation of the original Ghostbusters, as the Easter eggs and connections to the original films basically place it in the Ghostbusters franchise, but are somewhat unnecessary. Later saying, a kid who has never seen the first two movies could very easily walk into the theatre and enjoy Afterlife without any prior knowledge or nostalgia. But overall, Ghostbusters Afterlife maintains a clear continuity with the 1984 original through its narrative and visual references, serving as a sequel in the words of Zacharek. Yet, as Proctor defines reboots, it also begins again, seeking to reignite a new diegetically independent sequence for modern audiences. But beyond the story and beyond the visuals, the continuity extends to the creative team. While Ghostbusters 1984 was directed by Ivan Reitman, Afterlife was helmed by his son, Jason Reitman. This choice further reinforces a sense of legacy and emotional connection between the two films, both on and off screen. Moving into the third section of this report, and the final section, we're going to discuss how audience received this new and refreshed Ghostbusters using academic sources and grey literature such as IMDb and Rotten Tomatoes to see what conversations were provoked. Here are the sites that I used. First off, we'll look into the statistics from Rotten Tomatoes and IMDb, both of which are film and television review and information sites. They're widely known and relied upon to reflect the general opinion towards film, but their reliability must be evaluated in consideration that IMDb's audience scores come from registered users, many of who are passionate filmgoers but not representative of the general public. The most significant takeaway from these numbers is the apparent disconnect between the critics and the general audience. The popcorn meter and the solid 7 out of 10 IMDb rating suggests that the film was really enjoyed by the public. This implies that the movie successfully delivered what the target audience was looking for, leading to very high satisfaction. However, the 63% tomato meter indicates that critics were mostly split. This is significantly lower than the audience score, suggesting that the film leans heavily on fan service and nostalgia. This pattern suggests that Afterlife was effective as a legacy sequel or a fan-focused revival. The mostly positive audience score suggests that the film's connection to the original film, its new cast, and its emotional beats resonated deeply with the public, particularly those who grew up with the 1984 film. Although these individual reviews constitute only a small fraction of the 5,000 ratings and cannot alone represent the overall viewer opinion, they highlight key themes of viewer discussions that I also saw across other reviews. They seemingly reinforce the overall picture of a strong yet not universal audience approval. They suggest that the audience brought up conversations on the role of nostalgia and fan service, as well as the new focus on family and the new generation, promoting ideas like legacy and continuation. It also appears that the audience addressed the overall quality and standalone merit, evaluating whether it succeeded independently of its predecessors. My personal research was conducted to test the hugely positive audience reception seen on sites like IMDb and Rotten Tomato audience score. My data reinforces the idea of the success of the film's family appeal and its appeal to a new generation, with 58% calling it a success. However, we shouldn't rely heavily on these findings as the sample is just too small with 11 to 12 people, and it's limited to mostly the 17 to 25 age range. This narrow focus means that the results are potentially biased towards a younger, less nostalgic viewpoint and shouldn't be used to represent the wider audience. But nonetheless, they still prove a point. Overall, relating back to my research focus, the evidence suggests that the 1984 Ghostbusters defined the franchise through its comedy, supernatural energy, urban charm, and subversive humour, while Afterlife appears to reinterpret these elements through the ideas of family, legacy, and nostalgia. This shift seems to be aimed at bridging generational audiences, preserving continuity with the original while reintroducing the story for a modern era. The audience's responses imply that this approach was largely effective in evoking familiarity and affection, though some viewers felt the film relied too heavily on nostalgic callbacks rather than developing entirely new storylines or character dynamics, highlighting a tension between innovation and homage in contemporary reboot culture. And these are my references. Thank you for listening.